standing here with this last panel, panel 4. We're going to talk about the future of elections and HAVA, the Help America Vote Act, 20 years from now. And as the panel description notes, HAVA was originally passed 5 years before the invention of the iPhone. And what that really shows you is how technologically advanced and sort of the landscape moves and tectonic shifts in the span of just 5 years, much less 20 years. And what have we seen in those 20 years? I think that from my perspective, in 2008 is when I became very close in election administration at the state level, and you started to see what the EAC was doing with standards and the testing program that they had. And I was in the state of Florida, and we had a testing program that was very much informed by what the Election Assistance Commission was doing. But HAVA was a congressional response to the technical challenges of 2002. And so I really see that the current where we are today is responding sort of to a couple of different things. Obviously, the technology is something that we're trying to keep up with as election administrators. I think that there's news and then there's good news. I think the news is that now the testing and certification of voting machines and the processes that it's a national security issue. It's as highlighted as never before. There's so much focus on this, as much focus as it was in 2000 and 2002. The good news, though, and it sort of gets lost with things, is since 2002, our voting systems have never been more secure, more accessible, more usable to the public and to our election officials. And that's frankly because there have been improvements over those 20 years. The threats are still there. We have to adjust to those threats. But from a fundamental level, our voting equipment has never been more accurate. That was the whole purpose of HAVA. And so we have a panel today that's going to discuss where we are and where we're going to go in the next 20 years, because I think it's going to be just as fast moving or even more than the last 20 years have been, and it's been extremely fast moving. And why does this even matter? It matters because the voters, the whole conference has been about how we build trust and voter confidence. And we have to be concerned about that. We absolutely have to be, as well as the Congress and the states demand that our voting systems are secure. They demand that they're accessible. And so where do we look over the next 20 years? In our panel today, I'm gonna do a brief introduction of them, then we're gonna let them talk about where they see HAVA in the next 20 years. First will be Doug Lewis, who was formerly of the Elections Center, and he was the executive director of NASED, National Association of State Election Directors, which I was a member for a number of years, almost 10 years. He played a key role in the adoption of the Help America Vote Act and the Election Assistance Commission. Dean Logan, who is the clerk and recorder and the registrar of voters here in Los Angeles County, California, which is the largest jurisdiction in the United States. I am glad that responsibility is not on my shoulders. And he's also a board member of Election Center, which, as we've discussed before, is a professional group that deals with training of local election officials and state election officials across the country. The next panelist we have is Deak, Kersey, who's the General Counsel, Deputy Secretary of State of West Virginia in that Secretary of State's office. He has also been a member of NASED and someone who we have worked with the EAC. Mindy Romero, who's the founder and director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, CID, at the University of South, USC, Sol Price School of Public Policy. And she's a California native here. Give a welcome to our guests. So why don't we just go right down the list here and look, take 3 to 5 minutes, talk about what the issues are on your mind. I have some issues, obviously we talked about.
We know.
Yeah, well, yeah, exactly. But I'd like you to talk about where we are and where we're going the next 20 years. And so each panelist could take between 3 and 5 minutes. That would be great. And then we'll go into some questions. Doug, we'll start with you.
Well, folks, thanks for hanging in here. I know we're the last panel of the day. If you get done listening before we get done talking, we'll find you in the bar, okay? I was one time introduced by an election official, and he said, "We're glad to have old Doug here today. He was here when Moses was building the ark." And I may not actually have been that long, but at 76, I'm almost old enough to be a poll worker. So I'm working up to it.
It's terrible.
Let me take just a second because you all are recording this, and hopefully elections officials around the country are going to have an opportunity to view this at some point. We need you. Those of you who are elections officials, this country needs you. We need you desperately. You are the people who make this process work, who make sure it's accurate, who make sure it's honest, who make sure it's fair. The arguments that people have about the process most of the time truly are not about you. Now, I know that you're going through a whole lot of criticism and a whole lot of attacks in this. Let me say to you, understand that America appreciates what you do, and we need you desperately to make sure democracy survives through all of the tribulations. You are, in my mind, every elected official in the United States needs to start singing the praises of the local elections operations and the state elections operations. We need to get out in front of this so that everybody understands the process is important. It's far more important than partisanship. It's far more important than philosophical disagreements on how we do things. This is, if we lose faith in democracy, you cannot believe in institutions, you cannot believe in government offices, you cannot believe in governments that result from it. And so this is how important it is that we're talking about all of this. And so I hope we can communicate to every office holder, you need to start speaking up and not stand up for your party, but stand up for democracy. Okay, where we are is, I think, when you look at the future of the Help America Vote Act and the future of elections, one of those, clearly we've heard from the panels before, is this whole security issue, which the EAC plays a really major role in the sense of doing processes that are so complicated that the general public doesn't understand them, but it's absolutely necessary to protect elections. And so I hope we are able to give you all continuous funding and continuous staffing to make sure that works, because the election systems today are infinitely better than they were 20 years ago. They are infinitely better. Now, one of the problems that we heard today is that we don't replace them often enough, you know? I mean, we get to the point that because government sort of has a habit, if you were to tell them that this stuff lasts 10 years, they'll find a way to stretch it to 15 or 16, you know? And so that's not wise when it comes to elections. And folks, let me tell you, if you think good elections are expensive, wait till you have a bad one. I guarantee you it gets really expensive at that point. And so where we want to be in this is looking at how to, in the future, do we take the concerns of citizens? And look, I know some of us get to the point that we get a little frustrated with some of the loudest voices that are out there and that want to talk about how the whole system is broken. The truth is, we have to do the process to where most of those who are rational and reasonable will understand how we get there and why we get there and why we do some of the processes we do. And so the EAC, as an agency of the federal government that is now 20 years old, and 20 years old in terms of the federal government is infinitesimal. You know, unfortunately, I learned a long time ago working with the federal government, you know, it basically has two speeds, eternal or glacial, you know, and yet with the EAC, look at what we've been able to do in 20 years' time. I mean, yes, we didn't change everything. We didn't get everything done. But within 20 years' time, we've got an agency that does provide resources, that is able to advise CISA and Department of Homeland Security, that is able to advise congressional members and their staffs on why we do certain things and why what they're proposing is not likely to work the way they intended. And so I think when we look at the future of this, we look at the future of having the ability to build that faith in the process. And so that all of you know, I've been around long enough, in this deal that I went through election 2000 and election 2004, where it was the other party that had concerns. And the Democrats were absolutely certain that something had to be done, that the elections officials were screwing up the process, and that they weren't counting votes accurately, and that some of those people had to be too partisan, and right on down the line. And of course, none of that was true. But we had to go through establishing why. Now, it took us 9 years, if you want to know the truth, it took us 9 years when we came out of that to reestablish that credibility and to get those vote totals back up in terms of how much the public thinks about elections. We had the highest we've ever really had in faith of elections from the general public is about 88%. There's always going to be that percentage that doesn't trust anything you do. But it took us that long to get back up to that deal. Now, we've got it on the other side this time. We've got it with Republicans being concerned and conservatives being concerned that the process is somehow broken and this process is somehow not working correctly. It's not true now either. But it doesn't mean that we can ignore those concerns and those fears. We have to face them up. And we have to do that. That's the beauty of what the EAC can do. The beauty of the EAC is it can command attention. The beauty of the EAC is it can help us get national attention focused on the right parts of this message, as well as the substantive parts of how it all works. And so I'm hoping that we can get to the point that once again everybody is happy with this, and that elections officials are really pretty simple creatures. They take in some registrations, they schedule an election, they put some voting systems out, they find places to hold for voting, they order ballots and they count ballots. That's really kind of a simple system, isn't it? Except it's far more complicated than that. I will want you to know, elections officials have one prayer. Dear Lord, please let the winners win big. So that there is no question about this. And so where we are is at a crossroads. In all of the time that I worked in public policy related to elections, elections have never been funded as well as any other part of government. Now, that's not true in about 25% of our jurisdictions. 25% of our jurisdictions have equal funding to whatever the job is of other departments or agencies in their locales. But that means 75% are not funded well enough. And so we are going, and in this day and age when you've got nation states trying to interfere with your election, and let me tell you, that's important and that's real. That's a real concern and something we need to worry about. But I'm also going to say to you, the biggest danger is us. We have met the enemy, and it is us. The Republicans complain that the elections process is not fair and that there's too much cheating going on and there's too much fraud going on. The Democrats complain that the elections process is not fair, it's not allowing all the people to vote, and that voter suppression, whatever that term means and whatever fraud means, those are two, big deals, but they're religious beliefs of the two parties. And so you have a tough time talking people out of that. The point is by doing what they do, they denigrate fundamental faith in this process. And let me tell you, folks, if we lose that faith in this process, we're not going to have a country that we know. It's not going to be one that we recognize. Because, look, the Greeks lost democracy. They created democracy. They invented it. And when they lost it for 2,300 years before another one shows up. And so that's the risk to humanity. That's the risk to America. That's the risk to democracy throughout the world. We have to do that, and that's why I am personally glad that we've got you guys involved in this. And so I'll stop at that point and let somebody else talk.
Thank you, Doug. Dean.
So thanks, Commissioner Palmer and the EAC and Pepperdine for having the forum today. Doug, we've missed you. I missed your opening jokes, and you're a hard person to follow on the last panel of the day. There's been a lot that's been said today, but I appreciate the opportunity to be here and talk a little bit about this. HAVA, I think for many of us in the room, the passage of HAVA was a very significant point in our careers. Some people left elections when HAVA was coming into play. I had briefly left elections right before HAVA, and actually HAVA is what sucked me back into this business. And then this week, thinking about the theme of this, about what it's going to be like in 20 years, I got distracted thinking about what I'd like to be doing in 20 years rather than HAVA. But I digress. I think it's an interesting time. I actually found, when I was thinking about this, I found a HAVA at 10 years retrospective that I was asked to write for a publication that Charles Stewart and Mike Alvarez put together for the Caltech MIT Voting Technology Project. And I was reading through it, and HAVA accomplished a lot. We did a lot in those first 10 years, but that future perspective of where do we go from here still remains relevant today. So as I was kind of reflecting on that, I was putting into the context that HAVA really came out of a close federal election that exposed the vulnerabilities, the lack of capacity, the lack of funding, and the some of the behind-the-scenes elements of elections administration in this country. Elections administration that at that time really wasn't built or designed for a razor-thin outcome. And after a lot of work and the passage of HAVA, we had a framework to quickly respond to those things, to get out advancements in technology, to get funding out to states and counties to address those vulnerabilities, those capacity issues, and to start standardizing some basic tenets of voting accessibility, second chance voting for people to check their ballots, statewide voter registration database that could provide for some uniform list maintenance activities. And as that progressed, then as we started to face these security issues, the cybersecurity concerns and the nation-state threats, HAVA and the AAC have been pivotal there. But where do we find us today? Today we're coming out of a 2020 election cycle, or I think some of us are hoping we can come out of the 2020 election cycle. Hasn't happened yet, but that was very different, but also significant with regard to HAVA, because in this case, what the 2020 election cycle has exposed is the political and partisan strategizing that impacts the administration of elections. It wasn't about the voting systems. It wasn't about the infrastructure. In fact, in the face of a international pandemic, the infrastructure of elections in this country held up pretty darn well, and we had a successful election. But we had an election in the face of all those challenges that was premised by people saying in advance of the election, I want it known, if it doesn't go the way I want it, there was something wrong with the election. So that narrative started before any votes were counted and continues today. And that has become the political strategy. So when I think about HAVA 20 years from now, the first thing that comes to mind is we don't have 20 years to correct that. If we don't correct that, and Doug, you alluded to this too, if we don't correct that immediately, then there won't be anything to look back at in 20 years. The degradation of the process, the degradation of the confidence, it won't matter who's being elected, it won't matter who's in the majority. If there's not trust and confidence in the elections process, that foundation fails. So I would argue first that we owe it to the work that we all did collectively in HAVA to turn that around. How we do that, I think, is tricky. I would like to believe, and I appreciated the comments in the first panel, that first and foremost, people in positions like mine, we need to be focused on just do your job right and let the rest of it happen. I appreciate that. I agree that's a priority. It has to be our top priority. But we did our jobs right in 2020, and it wasn't enough. And we have to be at the table and part of turning that narrative around. Otherwise, we're going to be in a world of hurt. So that's kind of the broad perspective that I wanted to share today. I think on a more specific note, again, the basic tenets of HAVA are not destinations, they're ongoing activities. The whole idea of Help America Vote Act, helping is an activity. You don't stop doing it, you don't achieve it at some point. It's something that requires you to pay attention to the environments you're operating in and continue to find ways to help, to improve, to maintain and move forward. And so, those basic tenets of accessibility, security, accuracy, transparency, usability, automation, serving our voters who are in the military and overseas, these were things that were key parts of that dialogue when HAVA was passed. And those are ongoing activities. We're not going to reach a destination on that. And that's why HAVA needs to be relevant going into the future. Unfortunately, and you've all heard lots of this today, the part of HAVA that was time matched was the funding, right? So the funding is not yet ongoing, and I don't need to repeat what everybody said here, but that's a critical component. And I think to the point that was made in the last panel, we have to strike that balance of what comes attached to that funding. I think it's clear we need the funding if we are truly going to help America vote and have trust and confidence in our elections. I think if we can tie that funding to those basic tenets, maybe not to the specifics of how those tenets are carried out in a given state or a given jurisdiction, but those tenets of, again, accessibility, security, accuracy, and transparency, then that's where we should head in the future. And then the last piece that I will say is as the only local election administrator to speak today, who's on the ground, and sometimes I kind of feel funny saying that because I don't. While I've been a very local election administrator in my past career, I really respect and appreciate the needs of smaller and medium-sized jurisdictions who don't have the capacity to be out in part of these conversations, who are doing the hard work. But I think that the other real important part of helping America vote is keeping the focus on the voter. And even today, we spend a lot of time talking about systems. We've talked a lot about policy. We've talked a lot about research. But at the end of the day, what's the voter experience like? Because that's what really is going to build the confidence. And so when I think about what's ahead for the next 20 years, what do we need to be paying attention to about our voting population? Some of that is changing demographics, right? Coming out of the post-pandemic realities are that voters expect now options. They aren't looking for one method of voting. They're looking for the option of voting that gives them their individual confidence about the security of the process and their ability to choose within some framework when, where, and how to cast their ballot. And frankly, that saved us in the pandemic. Because had we only had one methodology of voting, it would have been very hard to conduct that election in the face of the pandemic. The other thing we have to pay attention to is changing demographics. LA County just recently created a new department, a Department of Aging and Disability, specifically focused on those two issues. It's been very illuminating for those of us who are department heads in the county, because we've learned a lot of statistics. Things like that half of 13-year-olds today are expected to celebrate their 100th birthday, and probably several beyond that. And the fact that by 2030, the older adult population is expected to double in our community. And that in that older adult population that are living longer, 42% of those people have some form of disability, some barrier that could affect their access to basic services and their ability to continue to participate in our electoral process. So we have to have a voting system and a voting process that's responsive to that, that's anticipating that, and that goes beyond kind of that mere compliance of having one piece of equipment that serves voters with disabilities over in the corner of the voting room that the poll workers cross their fingers and hope nobody wants to use it, right? That's not going to cut it going forward. Contrast that to the other fastest growing population, at least in this community, are people under the age of 30 that are going to have a very different expectation about those services and what citizen participation means and how we serve those. So I think it's important that we don't get stuck in on one hand, celebrating the success we've made, saying we did great, we had the success in 2020, even in the face of a pandemic, but the work is not done. This is engagement it's critical engagement for our governance structure, and it only works if we're responsive to the voters who have to participate in order for it to work. So I could get down in the weeds. There's other little things like, again, really being wary of single points of vulnerability in the system. Vote by mail arguably saved us during the pandemic. A different type of emergency that shuts down the U.S. Postal Service creates a different situation. So hanging all of our hats on one peg is not going to be the answer. The other thing, and I've taught, and this was actually in the article at HAVA in 10 years, so we obviously haven't solved this one yet, but there's so much about our electoral process that depends solely on the validity of the match of a voter's signature to the signature that they have on file. And signatures just aren't what they aren't, they don't have the utility they used to have. We don't have that muscle memory in our hands. We don't sign our names, and when we do, we don't really pay attention to how we sign it. We just scribble something because we're at CVS and we're trying to get our points, right? But there's so much. I mean, whether it's access for a candidate to get on the ballot, whether it's validity of your vote by mail ballot, whether it's signing a petition for initiative and referendum or recall, those things are solely left to signature verification. And we've done some great things in the last 10 years of creating policy that allows voters to be notified and cure that. But those are really resource intensive, they're costly, they're time consuming, and they yield very little in terms of results, because by the time you notify a voter, hey, your ballot is sitting here and your signature didn't match, they also know the outcome of the election at that point, so how motivated are they to cure that ballot? But they are still frustrated that their ballot didn't count. So those are just a couple of examples that I would say on a specific level of things for us to pay attention to. And again, kind of to end back with the cost, and Doug, you said it so well, that the cost of stagnation or inertia and inaction far outpaces the cost of an ongoing, steady commitment of resources that are based on those basic tenets of HAVA that we all work together on.
Thank you, Dean. I took away from that we got a lot of hard work ahead of us. We're only beginning this panel. Deak, Kersey from West Virginia. We talked a lot about accessibility already, and how that's a key part of HAVA and EAC. Could you talk about what your thoughts are on this 20 years from now, and how do you see serving the voters in West Virginia?
Yes, thank you, Commissioner Palmer. This morning when we heard the words of President Bush, if you listen, you heard a phrase that you hear a lot of election administrators use across the country. He said, HAVA was really based on this premise that we want free, fair, secure elections. And so HAVA is not the only federal law that was designed aimed at that premise. You've got the ADA, you have UOCAVA for overseas military voters. You have the Rehabilitation Act, which is well before HAVA was even thought about. You have the MOVE Act. And all of these things sort of go together into HAVA. And I'll talk a little bit about the court decisions and some of the analyses you see that judges apply to HAVA and the ADA specifically and the accessibility side of the world. But I just want to point out from the get-go that accessibility is a foundation of HAVA, of the ADA, of UOCAVA, of the MOVE Act. We're focused not just in 2022 or in 2020 or in 2002 on providing everybody meaningful opportunities to participate, whether you have the ability to go into a polling place and use a voting machine or vote from home on a paper ballot without assistance. So in West Virginia, in 2017, we came into office. Our Secretary of State was very focused on UOCAVA accessibility. He comes from a military background overseas. He served in war zones in multiple places across the world. And he personally experienced being disenfranchised. He couldn't get a paper ballot through the mail, and at the time that was the only option because of the short time frame. And so he thought, if we can communicate using technology, why can't we, and if we can send secure documents electronically, why can't we use technology to send ballots, at least to people who need it most, at least to these identified groups or sectors of our society that don't have the same opportunities as those us who do stateside or who aren't living with the disability to participate. And so we used technology in the 2018 midterms. We did a very small pilot, and we transferred ballots electronically to voters overseas, deployed military, and they could mark that ballot electronically, and if they so choose, they could send it back electronically. Lots of questions are raised on the security side of the world, but we know we solved the accessibility problem. They didn't have to worry about finding a printer. They didn't have to find a fax machine. They didn't have to rely that their county clerk was going to open this PDF email from this .doj account they'd never seen before. And they certainly didn't have to worry about, on the request side, whether or not the Federal Voting Assistance Program was going to get their information in time on paper to get it over to the county clerk. It's thousands of miles away. And so building on our UOCAVA technology that we adopted, we immediately saw that this technology could be used and another group of our society, and that's for our disabled voters. Those who can't participate in person because of their disability and who can't mark a paper ballot without assistance. They're waiving their right to secrecy. They have to have someone help them mark their ballot. And so our state legislature passed a law proactively, and now we are required to extend the same opportunities to voters with disabilities in West Virginia as we do for our military, our overseas citizens. And so that's what we're doing right now. Tying that into just yesterday or the day before, the state of Wisconsin, there's a federal district court that just rendered a decision that said under the ADA, or under the Voting Rights Act, excuse me, voters have to have the same meaningful opportunities to participate as those who do in person. Absentee voters have to have the same opportunity to participate as those in person, as those mailing in ballots. And so it was precipitated on a state law challenge, and I won't bore you with the legal garb, but what we know now is it's still real that we have states and jurisdictions that are battling over accessibility. We see this in North Carolina recently, in the state of Texas recently. Where it started, I don't know. I can tell you when HAVA was passed, I was in 7th grade. So I've not been around as long as some of the veterans in here. So sorry, Mindy. But what I do know is when I've studied these legal issues when we were doing it in West Virginia, accessibility and fairness and equal opportunity are all prevalent over things like security. Now you have to balance accessibility with security, and that's where I think the EAC can come in. The future of HAVA and the future of the ADA and the future of the VRA and all the other federal laws that we have to follow, I think could be focused on developing standards like Tracy talked about that are uniform, that we can follow not just for voting systems for our in-person participation, but also for our voters who can't vote in person because of something beyond their control like a disability, because they chose to serve their country in another, and now they're in another country during the election period. Developing standards is not an easy thing. We just now have VVSG 2.0. But West Virginia was able to work with federal contractors for our recent deployment of our accessible technology. And we pulled from other critical infrastructure sectors. And we look at NIST standards and the CMMC standards, and we tried to find those that applied most to what we were doing. We were transmitting information using electronics. We were using the internet. We were using databases, and we were using devices that are in other people's control, that are beyond the state's control. So lots of risks there, lots of attack vectors. But other critical infrastructure sectors have solved some of these problems, or at least they have protocols in place, and they have controls in place, and security standards in place, that it lets us know, from a foundational standpoint, the technology that this critical infrastructure sector is using has been vetted by outsiders, third parties, Vistals, perhaps even federal agencies like the EAC. And if not the EAC, who? We don't have another EAC-like agency that can lead this charge. FVAP does it for UOCAVA, but we don't really have an ADA side of the world for our absentee voters. So the EAC seems to be naturally fitted to fill this role. They've developed standards for in-person voting systems, and this perhaps is an opportunity looking forward to develop standards for other systems, looking at e-poll books, looking at electronic ballot absentee delivery and marking, and other things. So I'll, again, also yield my time back to the commissioners.
Thank you. And I will yield back to Ms. Mindy Romero. What do you think? What are your thoughts as we look at the next 20 years?
Well, first off, thank you very much for having me here today. Can you hear me okay?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. And when I was signaling to Deak a moment ago not to mention that you were in 7th grade, it wasn't because it made me feel old. I was even younger, of course. I just thought, in an age-diverse group, it wasn't polite to... Anyway, as I start, I really want to actually pick up on something that Dean said. Not a surprise, but Dean was talking about keeping the focus on the voter today. And so the remarks that I prepared was just, thinking about in advance of today, thinking about the topics that were on the agenda, the speakers, and how I kind of assumed the flow of conversation would go. I knew it would be, of course, incredibly rich and insightful and important. But I wanted to make sure that I was, given that I was going to be on the last panel and the last person, at least, for this element, I wanted to make sure that I was focusing on the voter. And what I think is the goal of many in this room, when we talk about HAVA, when we talk about the NVRA, when we talk about election reforms, when we talk about good election administration, is we want to see an accessible election run well, administered well, of course, and we have many things that we have to be concerned with today. But we also want to see voters participate, right? Ultimately, the goal of HAVA and so many things, so many reforms, has been about participation. What that exactly looks like, I'm sure that varies, when we say, increased participation, a full electorate, that's gonna probably mean different things to different people in the detail in this room, but I imagine that all of us kind of share that in the wide definition, if that makes sense. And over the course of the panels today, we, of course, talked about the state of democracy in America, and I certainly agree with many of the concerns and challenges that have been discussed. But I want to set the stage in terms of where I see the state of elections right now, the thing that I want to add to the conversation, not the full, I agree with many of the things that have already been said, as I mentioned, but what I want to add to the conversation that I don't think really has been discussed today. And then I'll talk about the future from there. So there are many bright spots, right? We've talked about so many concerns, but let's note that there have been democracy successes over recent years. There's many election reforms that have been implemented across the country, and I will say, since we are the host state, California is also a bright spot there because we, over the last decade, have helped pass and implement our election officials in this state, our Secretary of State's office, Dean leading the way in Los Angeles, and many community groups, voting advocacy groups, have helped implement a number of reforms, AVR, pre-registration, the Voters' Choice Act, just expansion of vote by mail, and the list, of course, goes on. Those have been implemented. They're still being implemented in many counties, of course, and we're tracking and understanding the impacts on the electorate. But I think by and large, it's a success story in our state, and we think that there are successes across the country with many of these reforms. And California, hopefully in some way, I think has significantly helped lead the conversation, right? Especially the research that comes out of our state. So another success that's also been noted today is the 2020 general election in terms of turnout. We saw historical turnout for that election in the general election. Voter turnout across all populations in our state, across the nation, improved with more Latino, Asian American, Black voters casting ballots than we've seen at least in any previous election, at least certainly in California's statewide election. And that means more voters of color are participating in our elections, and that's exciting, right? Okay, and all this happened within a pandemic, when so many of us were concerned, as I know, if I may, I think Dean was as well, many of us right across the field were concerned that, would the pandemic suppress turnout, right? Would people be fearful of health, all of that? Would we be looking at a lower turnout? But of course that didn't happen. However, the increases didn't translate, and I want to make sure that this is something we talk about today. They didn't translate into a more representative electorate. So when we talk about increases, we know everybody increased, but when we talk about representation, we're looking at the gaps, right, across groups. So if we want to just keep it simple and talk about race, ethnicity, and the four largest groups in our country as we track and we have available data, the gaps between whites and blacks and white turnout and black turnout, Latino turnout and white turnout, Asian American turnout and white turnout. A bit of a mixed bag, but we didn't see substantial growth any way we slice it. And we just use simple current population survey data, which is by the census, which has its problems, known problems, in terms of being able to give us accurate numbers by race, ethnicity. But we just use those numbers to kind of keep it simple. We know the gaps in turnout rates stayed about the same between whites and Latinos. If we compare 2016 general election to 2020 general election, gap in turnout rates increased between whites and blacks, white turnout increased higher than black turnout in the US, and that's coming off of a big dip in black turnout from 2012 to 2016. And a bright spot, though, that's why I said mixed bag, turnout decreased between Asian Americans and whites nationally for a number of reasons, although we're still trying to understand. And there's, of course, lots of other researchers out there with different methodologies in terms of being able to identify turnout. But I think everybody that's looking at turnout, whatever sources you're using, there's no big story, unfortunately, to say, hey, this historically high turnout gave us a situation where we saw greater representation, where we saw those gaps close or narrow in a real way across the board. Does that make sense? Okay, so we celebrate the turnout, but we also look to say, hey, representation, right? And that leaves us, because of those gaps in turnout, it leaves us with an electorate that continues to be, right, not representative of our population in the US, across the US, in our state here, is older, wealthier, whiter, and I could go on in terms of the demographic groups. And that's real because that's the promise ultimately, I think, right, in terms of all of these reforms for many, is to see a more representative electorate. So what should we be thinking about future elections? As I noted, last decade, the collective we have focused a lot on reforms, but let me say that the reforms have mostly been about making people want to vote. And I think a couple of you, including Dean, was at a place recently, at Future of California Elections Conference, where I was talking about some of this, so you'll have to hear it again, I apologize, but just some of it. Those reforms are really about, the reforms that we've seen are really about making people want to vote. I'm sorry, making it easier for people to vote, right? Access. What I've spent the last 20 years of my career looking at, which is institutional reforms. How can those reforms, right, increase participation, but also representation? But what we know is all of those reforms incredibly important, and some of them have already, like in California, been documented to increase, like vote by mail, documented to increase turnout, and for voters of color in many ways as well, and for young people. They are incremental steps, and they increase, at best, turnout in incremental numbers, in small numbers, if that makes sense. There's been tremendous work to pass these reforms, tremendous work to implement the reforms, but the hard truth is that the reforms are largely incremental steps. They're critical steps in reducing barriers to participation. I'm not saying we don't pursue them. Of course we have to, we must. They definitely help, many individuals vote. They improve the voter experience overall, which is so fundamentally important. They improve, give more ways for people to vote, as Dean talked about today, more ways to cast their ballot, ability to cure your rejected ballot, the list goes on. But they're not enough to move the needle in a significant way when it comes to turnout and when it comes to representation, as we measure representation, at least in terms of, again, the groups that we have data for. So we're not changing the turnout gap story or the representation story in big ways. We're not moving that needle, as I said. So what do we need to do? And I know that, we're talking about election administration, and of course there are limits to what election, even the most concerned and passionate and election official goes above and beyond, there are limits to what you can do, right, within the electoral structure we have, within the election laws that we have. But again, for something to think here today, we need to not just work on making it easier for people to vote. We need to also focus on making more people want to vote, right? That's the motivation question. And here I'm not talking about, voters are apathetic and we need to, no, I'm saying that we need to give people, right, help people to see the value in voting, to overcome many of the real barriers that are in place for why people don't participate, the level of disconnection that people feel. It's tough because many, not all voters, but many potential voters don't see how the act of voting impacts their lives, especially communities in poverty where families are just barely getting by. They can struggle so much financially taking care of their families. They simply don't have time, energy, the motivation to learn about the election, to learn about the voting process, and the importance of having a voice in the political process. They sometimes have little knowledge about why their vote can make a difference, little evidence that they see, right, that they're connected to in terms of why it matters, why it does make a difference. Some voters are outright distrustful that elected officials, any in the room, present company excluded, and I said elected, not election officials, but elected officials are actually serving the interests of their communities. And for some, it's not about wanting to make a mistake. They don't vote because they don't want to make a mistake. They don't have enough information. They don't feel comfortable or confident in the voting, and they don't want to pick somebody that's going to hurt their community, right, is the way they may see it. So they sit out the process because they don't want to make a mistake, right, that's hurtful or harmful. So, and even voters who go to the polls regularly often quietly confess, maybe some of you have heard them, that they don't vote out of a sense, that they vote. They confess that they vote out of a sense of civic duty or social responsibility, but maybe personally they don't have much faith that their vote is actually going to make a difference. So they vote, it's my civic duty, but they don't really themselves know that it matters, right, or believe that it matters. So now more than ever, so many have come to believe that politics are rigged in favor of those with power, access, wealth. Again, that's perceptions, right? To the advantage of one party or another. This is especially true, of course, for many communities of color who have been historically marginalized and often long experienced a lack of representation by their elected officials. Then add to this the increasing problem of widespread voter, I have a lot of pages only because it's a really big font because, okay, I am getting a little old and I can't see. Then add to this the increasing problem of widespread voter misinformation and the politically polarized times in which we live in. And it shouldn't actually be surprising why many people simply aren't motivated to vote or they've lost the faith in the process if they had it to begin with. So we need to talk about how our electoral system is structured, how it makes people feel, or can at least, feel disconnected, makes people feel that their vote doesn't matter. I won't get into all of that today, but I'll just touch on it here just a little bit. But first, I just want to note that all of this, of course, is very much impacted by our nation's shameful history and deep history of systematically denying the right to vote. So why people feel disconnected, that's a part of it, right? We have to acknowledge that. Denying people the right to vote, targeted by race, ethnicity, age, religion, geography, so on. We are still dealing from the impact of this voter suppression and marginalization today that shows up in the research that we do, that I do as well. And of course, efforts to overtly suppress the vote, continue across the nation in many different forms, some obvious, some not so obvious. And on top of this, we have, though, those bright spots that I mentioned, those election laws, those election reforms that are about increasing access, right, to voters, like many of the ones that I noted specifically here in California. And in addition, although this is also, of course, clearly related, is how our democracy and elections are fundamentally set up. How they are set up has consequences on political behavior. And here I'm talking about something bigger, the fundamental nature of how our elections are structured that influences how competitive or representative races are. Things like the majority, winner-take-all districts, right? That has real, and now I'm not suggesting anybody right here has the power to change that, but it should be something that we discuss, right, in an ongoing way, and just understanding at least the impacts that it has on voters in terms of discouraging them, right, for thinking that their vote matters if they think it's already a safe district, for instance, right? That's an easy way to think about it. And all of this we should consider within the very real reality of demographic change, which Dean already stole from me. Over the last decade or decades, the United States has experienced a number of significant demographic shifts. We know this is going to continue. We've gotten more racially and ethnically diverse, we've gotten older, but we also have more young people coming into the electorate, which is also shaping the needs of voters and potential voters, certainly from an election administration perspective. And lastly, I'm just going to close on funding. So there's many things that we could consider if this is a broader conversation around maybe some of those changes to our electoral system. Maybe not the big fundamental, like winner-take-all systems, but certainly things like, politics, political influence of big money and those kinds of things we could be talking about that all influence, again, how people see the relevance and the relevance of their vote and how it matters and how they feel disconnected or maybe hopefully feel connected to the political process. But one big thing is that we should be funding our elections. This has already been noted many, many times today, of course. But I don't know if anyone has talked about, and I missed the third panel, my apologies, but the $400 million potential amount for the federal budget. That is something we, of course, all should be, I would argue, not in just support of, but also championing. What we have now, and I was just talking to somebody that I know many of you know, Kim Alexander, yesterday, and she was encouraging me. We were talking through this topic and just really recognizing that we put everything on the backs of local elected officials. We have federal, we have state, and we have local. All of us suffer from the consequences of the fact that funding really is at the local level, right? The responsibility from whether it be security, all the way to dealing with misinformation on local social media, to just the facts of good election administration. And we need to give, of course, more support in a very much larger way, not only to our local elected officials, but to recognize the interconnectedness of all of this and the fact that we are not fully supporting the local level, again, at everybody's expense. And I will end it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Romero. So I'm going to ask a general question, first to Doug, but everyone please weigh in. So when we think about, we're a little bit short on time, but when we think about those that have the most need from a funding perspective, the small and medium counties that triggered something, that how do we really raise them to a level where we want all of our county officials to be, or locality officials to be? And when I also talked about those who need the most need, we usually think about those that are more remote, like, or have most difficulty voting, for example, those with disabilities, or those that might be overseas in a remote area. So if Doug, if you could just touch on that, and then we'll sit on the row on any suggestions, and we have plenty of questions, but those are the first things that came to my mind listening to your comments on funding and on voters who need more assistance to be able to participate in the process.
Don, I think part of this is we need to break down and do the look again statistically at where the voters are. And roughly, if I remember correctly, and I've been out of it for 7 years here, so I'm not sure of my data, but as I remember it, about 72% of the voters come from about 25% of the counties.
Yep.
And so the rest are then scattered through all those other 3,000 counties in America.
All right, so how do we help them? How do we get the grant
Well,
money?
I think part of this is recognition that these folks don't have access to travel money. They don't have access to, most of the time, to go get training from outfits like the Election Center or IGO or any of those other things, or even EAC. And so we're going to have to figure out a way, how do we get better training to them? How do we get better resources to them? In most of these small counties, the choices really come down to, do we buy a road grader to clear the roads when the snow comes, or do we put more money in elections? And what we've got in most of America, among most governing officials at the local level, is what I call the 1776 syndrome, which is we've been having elections since 1776, whether we spend any money or a lot of money, And so this is one of those where they tend to poo-poo that they need to do more. Where we are in terms of safety and security of voting systems, those local levels, those small 2 and 3 and 4 person operations, they don't have the technology skills to do this. And so we need to fund from EAC level to bigger counties who then support smaller counties, or develop regional support groups where we put in a good technical person to do that sort of thing. We certainly need to give them more resources with which to do their job. It was amazing to me when I first came back into the election administration world and started traveling around and started talking to these folks. Most of them, when I went out in those smaller didn't even have a fax machine in those days. This is the 90s. Fax machines were everywhere. They were cheap. And yet they would still have to go to the county sheriff's department or the tax office to get access to a fax machine. Most of them now have computers. I want to say, when Charles was talking this morning about we're doing the same job with the same number of people, that's not true. We had more people in all of these offices doing elections in 1950 than we've got in most of these offices now, because it was primarily a manual process, and we were having to process all of that with clerks And so we assigned a lot of people to this, and we did a lot of. Now that we've got computers, they expect us to do the work of 50, taking care of multiples of voters higher than we ever did before. And so the recognition has got to come. Charles, bless his heart, I've always loved Charles, that he's data-centered. One of the things we need to look at is in data-centered stuff is how do we actually look at what they can do per voter and get this thing done, you know, and
From a funding mechanism?
funding mechanisms. And let me tell you, here's the real crux of the problem when it comes to the federal government funding. The crux of the problem is that there are so many local officials, not election officials, local officials, budget authorities, who are so afraid that if we accept federal money, we're going to have to do it the federal way. And let me tell you, in the Help America Vote Act, we had to fight that for 2 cotton-picking years, to where we said, no, you cannot be prescriptive about everything. We've got to allow this process to work. And it was the first time the federal government had ever done the kind of bill that we did in HAVA, which was, we're going to tell you what we want as outcomes. You all design the process to fit that.
Well, we're very lucky. HAVA is a very unique block type grant to the states. It could have been a lot worse. But it really is a model when other agencies look at our grants, are like, wow, that's really sort of deferential to the states. Any other comments from the panel on sort of how we help the small, medium-sized counties get to a level where they need to be, or we believe they need to be? Because we're only as strong as our weakest, county.
I think just a couple things that I don't think there's a silver bullet answer to that, but I do think some built-in flexibility into the funds so that it can adapt to the size or the capacity of the jurisdiction. And I think some of it goes to some of the things that were talked about earlier. I mean, the more we move to non-proprietary component-based systems, then that enables the ability. So for instance, if we all had tally systems that can use commercial off-the-shelf scanners to get images of their ballot, but they can be system agnostic to the software that does the tabulation, then you could envision a situation where the state could take in the money and they could actually buy the scanners and distribute them to those counties. Building into the ability for those local jurisdictions to have an equipment replacement fund, so maybe in their election cost recovery model, there's a portion of that that's set aside so it builds a funding source for equipment replacement. Some investment, and I know this one's tricky, but some investment in research and development. We talked about how excited we are that the new VVSGs have passed, but the very limited commercial vendor community is not going to build systems to those new standards until they know that they have customers that have money to buy them. So they're not doing the building of them yet. Some incentive grants to either build publicly owned systems, which is something I'm partial to, or to incentivize the market, I think would be helpful in that regard as well.
Okay. Dean, your comments initially, you said the immediate issue is trust in elections, and we focus on that in this. When I think about the efforts made by local election officials, state, and the federal government, the AAC, and others, I guess the question is, how can we improve and expand that communication to voters? I mean, we don't have Super Bowl ad money, right? I mean, so it really is sort of us doing the tackling and bockling the local or basic level on social media. Is there any insight on how we can improve that communication to voters, just so they know we're the trusted source or the local election official is that source?
Yeah, I think first is making the distinction between what that outreach and education looks like, and that it's about the process of elections administration. It's not about the outcome of elections administration. Right. So it's not about who you're voting for or the positions. It's about the mechanics of how elections are run. And I think you're right. We're never going to have the money to do that on our own. But I think if we can draw that clear line, we may be able to get partners who are running ads during the Super Bowl who can say, again, on the mechanics of running elections, if you need to know how to vote in your community, you need to talk to your local election administrator or to your Secretary of State's office. If you want to know who your party's endorsing, go over here. But for the mechanics, or if you have questions about that. And I think there was some discussion earlier about working with the social media platforms. I've been in a number of meetings on that. I think there's a desire to do that. It's a tough nut to crack because I think they want to just build new services as opposed to providing ways to clarify it. But it's real, so I think we have to continue to have those dialogues too. We can't do it alone.
So, anyone else have any input on that? Any comments? You know, so the one thing that's also pressing is we've talked about VVSG 2.0. We've talked about how we don't want it to be stagnant. We want states and counties to be able to purchase a next generation of voting systems and have the luxuries of new security, new audibility, and new accessibility standards. How do we get there? Let's not make it 20 years. How do we make sure that 10 years from now, you know, most of the country is functioning on 2.0 systems? How do we do that?
Again, I think part of this answer is as you heard from other panels here, is that we have got to get to the point that we say voting systems are so critical to the process of this now that funding, if nothing else comes ever, that funding for voting systems alone needs to be done because it's an expensive proposition. Because you all have now given us VVSG2, it's probably going to be 4 to 5 years before we actually see the first system that meets those qualifications totally, that has it. And the vendors, Dean's absolutely right, the vendors are going to wait until there's a market for it too, you know, or demand for it. This is part of the reason we may have to get to the point that eventually we say, you know, we can't grandfather in old systems anymore. We got to sort of move, and if you move toward it, we'll help you fund it. And so I think we're going to have to look at some different models of how we do this. Now, let me give you, for instance, New Mexico provides at the state level a general pot fund, and if you want to buy a new voting system, you go to the general fund and you take out a loan, essentially. And you buy your system, and then you repay that loan, and it goes back into that fund, and that revolving fund then helps them take care of all their counties over a period of time. And so we may have to look at something similar, although I honestly think, my goodness, the federal government, you know, if we had to replace every voting system in America, it probably would be at about $2 billion level. And for most of these. And so we waste more than $2 billion, you know, and this is democracy we're talking about. You know, this is voting. This is how we govern ourselves. And so I think part of this is finding a way to tell the story in ways that people can relate to. The unfortunate fact of that, Don, is that we also end up having to deal with the partisans of both sides who want to tell us exactly how to, you know, structure this and how that money is to be spent and exactly what it can be spent on and all that, rather than giving us the right to sort of do what we need to do.
Yeah. Any other comments on how we get to 2.0 in the next couple of years? Deak?
One thing I'll mention is, unlike California, West Virginia is not able to set up our own independent testing laboratories and develop our own standards. We rely on the EAC to do that testing for us, and only systems that are certified by the EAC can apply for certification at our state's election commission. If that certification goes away for a certain system that was previously certified, it can no longer be used in the state. It becomes decertified. So it's not something I'm advocating for, because we would have a lot of counties scrambling. But if we're looking at moving forward to technology that satisfies VVSG 2.0, that's one way that would force our hand into finding funding, whether it be through the EAC, through the state, through the county, or a combination of the three, to upgrade. And we've seen it done in other states. It can be done quickly. It's messy, and it's chaotic, and it's expensive, but the state of Virginia decertified their machines very quickly and then upgraded to a voter-verified paper trail. So not to call Virginia out, but they did a good job. I mean, it was chaos, and they got it done in the midst of an election cycle. So it's been done before, and it would be one way to force us into having a VVSG 2.0 compliant machine.
The only thing I'll add is just, and I think this is what was being alluded to as well, funding takes public support, right? And I think particularly if you're talking about upgrades in technology in the environment we're in, people can be even more suspicious, if you will, in terms of like what are those new technologies for? Are they, what's the software? Are they pre-programmed? All those sorts of things. So just all the more important that as we're seeking funding, we really are making sure that we're outreaching, explaining and building trust over time with voters in terms of being able to get that funding at the bottom line, creating a sense of urgency around it.
So, you mentioned, the effort to get funding. I mean, one of the things that comes to my mind, and hopefully all of you can weigh in on this, how do you build that bipartisan consensus that you need funding? Part of the story I heard about the initial HAVA was the law was passed, and then only did they realize that, well, there's no money attached to it. It's not going to work unless there's some money appropriated to the states to transition. But how, you were there with, how do you build that consensus for that, that infrastructure funding, the roads and bridges of elections? It's like, this isn't a partisan, this is really just the fundamentals of elections.
Don, what we did, both between the Election Center and NASCED, we had been meeting with congressional folks for about 5 years before HAVA happened. I mean, before Election 2000 happened. And so what we did is we got the policymakers to understand that 95% of our elections issues are truly not of a partisan nature. It's not the Democratic way or the Republican way of doing things. It's just how do you run a good election and serve voters well. There is 5% of that, but 5% of that that's policymakers' deal. That's not our deal. They can determine what they want to. We'll run an election. Even if it's screwy, we'll figure out a way to run an election to meet their objectives. But what we did was, by having both D's and R's, liberals and conservatives, who were elections officials, meeting with them over a period of time, and particularly with congressional staff at the committees of jurisdiction, Senate Rules, House Admin, we were able to get them to understand what the real issues were in this, and then to see unintended consequences of what something might happen or do. And so that consensus got us to the point. Now, part of the reason that we had bipartisan action was we had a national disaster on our hands, and folks of both parties didn't want to be guilty of saying no to having to fix it. But having the trust, it was the first time in American history that the U.S. Congress involved the people who were doing the job to actually say, how do we fix it? And so we need to continue
So that's
that.
the model, right?
That's the model, that's right.
Any comments, Dean, Deak?
I would just say that, and it's not easy to do this, but I think to your point, to get away from the partisanship is to try to establish a dedicated, consistent federal investment in elections. So it's not responding to the latest crises and to the partisan elements of that. To say that no, as critical infrastructure, there's a place for a certain level of federal funding in our electoral process, and it's consistently funded. I think that needs to happen at the state level too. Right now, funding typically follows a crisis, and in that respect, it's time limited and it's specific. It's like punch cards with a controversy. So here's money, replace punch cards by tomorrow,
Yeah.
and the money's gone, and then we move on. That's going to feed into the partisan element.
I'll just add something Charles mentioned earlier, 1950s. Don't look surprised. You're always very quotable.
Charles discussed this in the 1950s?
No, earlier he mentioned the time periods, right, in the U.S. where we've had these moments.
I
And
was alive then, Charles was.
what we could gain, right, what we could learn, and what you said you learned, right, was leadership. And of course, I'm sure many of us were thinking, we don't have that leadership now. We have it in some places, but you asked a question about bipartisan. Certainly within our current slate of elected officials, but also former elected officials, others stepping up to create a sense of urgency, and build trust, and really make the case is so critically important. And we're not, Amy Klobuchar is wonderful to have. The people that we have, the few constants that we have currently in Congress that are leading the charge, leading the conversation around the need for funding The Electoral Count Act gives me hope, the work that's happening around there. But we need greater leadership, and unfortunately, I think right now people are making calculations that they're not stepping up in big ways.
So we're quickly running out of time. While I see that a couple questions may come my way, we probably have time for one or two at most. While that's coming to me though, and I have a chance to look at them, the question is how, we just went through a pandemic, and we actually had to hold an election with a pandemic and be able to respond to that, provide to the voters, opportunities and options. What are the crises of the future? If it's a natural disaster or a pandemic, or other. I mean, what should we be thinking about the next 10 to 20 years on helping states and localities prepare for the next natural disaster? What are we not doing? What should we be focusing on?
Well, part of this, Don, is you can't anticipate, obviously, all the disasters. You can anticipate some of them because the ones we know, weather, bomb scares, terrorist activity, just a failure to make the process work the way it's supposed to, and so on. You can do that because you go through a process of planning, and then once your disaster happens, the plans sort of go out the window.
Well, that's true.
You've trained yourself to think about how to do this, but now that you've got the disaster, it doesn't really fit your plan, And so the important part of this is to anticipate.
Okay. Anyone else want to tackle that?
I just say what I said before. I mean, I think the good news is what we learned in the pandemic is we actually do have the ability to respond to a crisis. We don't know what the crisis is going to be, but our ability to do that depends on having multiple modes of operation. We can't rely on a single mode of operation.
That's true.
I'll add one quick thing. I mean, certainly I think the pandemic did. I mean, in California alone, within weeks of the state shutting down, the nation shutting down, so many, elected officials, election officials, advocates, community groups, Secretary of State's office came together to start planning for November, and it was quite incredible. And of course, we already noted many times today the success of administration in 2020, even in the pandemic. But what I will say is, it's all those other crises. I won't say smaller crises, right? And my question would be, does every local jurisdiction have a crisis prevention or a crisis reaction plan? Are they prepared?
I would say generally yes. I think though that it was quite, the pandemic and discussions at the federal level, a lot of it was some states were actually having to change the entire way they voted.
Yeah.
I mean, that's so significant that there were only a few months to adjust. Almost impossible. It could have been a total train wreck. And there's a lot of reasons why that didn't happen. But when you're talking about such significant changes, and it was a pandemic that scared a lot of people, a lot of voters, that I think the election officials adjusted very well. We really have time for one question, and it's a good question from Grace Gordon, Bipartisan Policy Center. What functions or issues would you like to see the EAC take on, continue, or sunset in the next 20 years?
So we talked a little bit about the quick start guides the EAC puts out, and those are very helpful for election administrators, and there are some for the public geared towards public consumption, taking action, where to find information. Back on the accessibility point, if we have some guidance, not just for election administrators and vendors for standards, but also for voters who live in states that haven't adopted accessibility standards yet, how can they find accessible means of participating if they can't vote in person? That's a heavy lift because there aren't a lot of options out there right now if you're not using technology. If your state hasn't adopted a law that allows them to use technology, what are your options? Vote in person or don't vote. Or waive your right to a secret ballot, getting assistance voting a paper ballot. So some guidance for those voters in states that don't have those laws yet may be something the EAC could focus on.
Thank you. Any other panelists on that?
Don, I wouldn't sunset at the current level from the 20-year history you've got up to this point. I don't know of anything that you ought to sunset at this point. Certainly, the ability for you all to do massive publications and distribution of those through every election jurisdiction in America is useful. No other organization in America can do that. You guys have got that in spades. It seems to me we're going to have to find a way at some point to figure out a way to use the internet for subject matter to help election officials understand this. One of the things I hope you can do at some point is find a way to educate judges at judicial conferences about what their rulings mean when they rule in certain cases close to an election, that its impact is enormous in terms of the safety and security of the election. Trying to get us to change practices and procedures at 180 days out is a nuts way to do things. You know, if it's important that we change it, let's change it after this election, and we'll all assign to that. But trying to change it during midstream is really difficult, because we find out that even though we think we've anticipated everything, until you've been through 3 elections with new rules and new procedures, you're still learning, you know, and what you need to do to help the voter have success. And so I just think one area I hope you get into is working with judicial conferences to help them understand why we do what we do and why it's important for them to maybe follow the guidelines of the Supreme Court on the Purcell rule. You know, just don't be starting to change things now. Wait until it's over with, and then we'll do it. You know.
Okay. Well, we're going to call that the Lewis rule. With that, that ends this panel, and I'm supposed to turn it over to somebody. Is it going to be the Dean?
Yeah.
Dean Peterson? Come on up here. Thank you.
Well, thank you all. It's been a lot of information. Now, how do you process information? You process information in community and with adult beverages. And thankfully, we have that arranged. All are invited a few miles north here on Coast Highway to a place called Spruzzo's, where we have refreshments of all kinds and heavy hors d'oeuvres. And again, I want to thank all of you. I know I'm saying this also to an audience that is not going to be able to join us up at Spruzzo's, so I'm very sorry about that. But wanted to thank again our friends at EAC. This has been the culmination of a lot of work and planning. I want to thank the commissioners that have worked with us and pulled this conference together. I would be remiss, and she hates it every time I say it, but if I didn't thank really the person that makes events happen here at the Policy School, and that is Melissa Espinoza, here for any of you who've worked with her. And our team here as well, Jackie Ramirez as well on the marketing side as well, and the rest of our team at the Policy School, very grateful for them as well. So as we say at Pepperdine, God bless you all. Thank you for your time here. Also those joining us at a distance, and we look forward to continuing this conversation at Spruzzo's.
I would be remiss if we didn't thank our staff as well. Kristen and others, and especially Tyler, who came, who is no longer with the EAC, but came here to be a part of this. So I want to thank everyone who was involved, commissioners and others, for all your hard work. This would not have been pulled off without that. So thank you.